Hey everybody, it's Tom and I'm back, and today we are going to take up an essay by, as many of you know, one of my favorite authors, Ivan Illich, the essay being Vernacular Values. He penned this. It's really three essays, or an essay broken into three sections. He penned this toward the end of the 70s. It was published in 1980 by a periodical Co-Evolution Quarterly. But these essays form sort of a foundation of a subsequent work by Illich, Shadow Work. Woo! All right, so much by a somewhat academic sort of preface. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? As the saying goes, this: amongst the myriad problems which we are confronting at this moment in history is a breakdown of the traditional political spectrum, or at least traditional so far as the past 3 or 4 centuries is concerned. That framework for the placement of different commitments along a spectrum, left to right, that roughly originates during the revolutionary happenings of the late 18th century. That this spectrum has broken down is not the consequence of an innate inutility, but as suggested by Ivan Illich in this essay, by the fact that it only includes one dimension of social choice, whereas one could contend that there are actually at least 3 major dimensions that need to be brought into our reflections. Now, the traditional left-right framework is still of avail when it comes to how we potentially arbitrate questions of distribution or political authority. But that being said, what gets lost in those sorts of assignments are 2 other sets of issues. One which revolve around the matter of technology. And here we have, let me just go ahead quickly and show you, try to show you in any event. I'll just see if I can bring this around here. So it's a rather crude illustration there of the spectrum. That's crude. I can't get the camera to reverse on my phone right now, but what you have are 3 axes of assignment. One going from left to right, which you've already sort of discussed. The other, which we could say is assigned to the y-axis. The technological axis moves from hard to soft, with harder technologies being modes of technology which require, or which rather create, a sort of infrastructural dependency. For example, you could look at the automobile as an example of a hard technology, because you can't simply have an automobile. In order for the automobile to be deeply effective as a mode of transportation, you need roadways and gas stations and mechanics and all the rest of it to make that efficacious. And these broad infrastructural dependencies are part of a paradox, whereby mass transportation actually, in a way, interferes with our ability to move freely. It's an irony which attends many contemporary institutions, not just that of transportation, medicine, education, and so forth, right? So there, contraposed to the hard technologies, you have softer technologies, or if you like, softer tools, which rather than foster dependency, actually enable a greater measure of autonomy on the part of the users. And here we are kind of seeing an echo of those sketches offered by Ivan Illich in a previous work of his, Tools for Conviviality. Though there you had the distinction between industrial tools and convivial tools. It doesn't really map exactly so, for reasons to which we will return momentarily. But to recapitulate, softer technologies like hand tools, it's an example of which Illich is fond, facilitate the autonomy of the user, both as an individual and as a member of a community. And as an important footnote, while softer technologies do tend to be smaller, if you like, in what they suggest, they do not necessarily have to be so. For instance, you can make a case that telephony, that is the basic telephone network, can be registered as a soft technology if certain disciplines are exhibited regarding how that telephony is installed in the society. Another example of a soft technology, a bicycle. Bicycle is another relatively soft technology. But the third axis, which, and this is the axis which is perhaps the most salient from this essay, which Illich brings to bear, is the tension, an axis of decisions as to human living that range on one hand from the industrial to the other, the vernacular, the industrial versus the vernacular. And the industrial commitment is a commitment to a certain characterization of human being that we inherit from modernity, and more specifically from a certain trajectory of political economy in modernity. What we have as the epitome of the industrial commitment is an anthropology which designates human being as fundamentally the being of Homo economicus. What is Homo economicus? It is that notion that we as individuals are ultimately an assemblage of needs to be addressed. And the irony of that circumstance is that by defining human beings as needs to be addressed, the system, which in principle would be addressing that needs, actually assumes primacy. And we subserve the system, its proliferation, its propagation. And the most marked way in which this becomes clear is that the more the system is generated to propagate the address of needs, the more it discourages our fundamental capacities to address those needs without reliance on the system. That is, the more that society makes decisions which are following from the presuppositions of Homo economicus, the less we are capable of addressing the same issues on our own terms. That characterization of human beings where we are addressing issues on our own terms is the domain of the vernacular as Ivan Illich posits it. And the contrary notion of human being that Illich offers is that of Homo habilis. That is, human beings as creatures which interact with each other and in their environment in a manner that moves toward freedom and engagement and mutuality rather than dependency and atomization and other various less than happy things that come out of the industrial package. Now, to be fair to the industrial package, what it is in part inspired by is an old trope that you can't really have freedom until you escape the bounds of necessity. And that's a powerful way of seeing and approaching certain issues. But left by itself, you have a bevy of distortions which can be seen to have perhaps not won the day, but have certainly asserted themselves to troubling extent here in the early 21st century. Now, this tension between the industrial and the vernacular, or if you like, the convivial, shows up both within its own terms, as I sketched up there, but to ramify for decisions we make around technology. And an important caveat here, it's pretty transparent that there is a kind of affinity between softer technologies and vernacular or convivial commitments. But we should be wary to think that that affinity is absolute. Because in reality, softer technologies can be appropriated and reframed to subserve industrial needs. You have a certain romanticization of the smaller and the petite that can be invoked, for example, oftentimes in the guise of ecologically friendly decisions to actually ensure a deeper and more problematic colonization of the human being. That is, the decision to, for instance, go towards so-called green power is motivated by the notion of extending the fundamental viability of the industrial system under the auspices of different arrangements regarding energy and equity. And you even will have, as a result, the consequent proliferation of very problematic austerities. I've talked about this assemblage of issues in other quarters under the banner of what I've used, the banner that I've used is philosophical misanthropy. You have a kind of hostility to the human being which shows up in lots of environmental and ecological rhetoric that flows from the same set of presuppositions, which Illich is designating here as to be resisted. Now, what is the vernacular? Because I said enough about the industrial and the problems associated, and what is the vernacular? Well, the vernacular, and we'll say more about it in subsequent videos, but as a point of departure, the vernacular is that which arises spontaneously with regard to modes of living, culture, being, etc., right? And one way you can see the difference between the industrial and the vernacular is in the attitudes toward work, which variously show up. Under the vernacular, the ideal which is posited is, as Illich puts it, the ideal of subsistence. Now, I'm not in love with that word because it certainly conjures a less than exciting set of connotations. To be merely subsistent, not exactly the most inspiring rhetoric. But abstracting from the rhetorical point for the moment, we can recall that what the life of subsistence reflects, especially in primary societies, is a life where there is a striving for fundamental harmony with life, with nature as it presents itself, untrammeled by the ideal of so-called progress. Progress here is designated by Illich as something which emerges not simply from modernity, but really from the dawn of Christianity, and a particular perversion of Christianity, which gives rise to modernity. Now here, we're speaking in historical terms. We're not talking about theological commitments one way or the other. One can circle back and examine theological commitment. But historically, this trajectory and this particular notion of progress finds reflection in the attitude toward the other or the alien, which transforms over the course of human history. In antiquity, the alien, the other, the outsider, that person or that group, they're designated as the barbarian, which will not, flattering, right? Perhaps they're not seen as fully human or just something which is simply outside, but they are apart. They are apart. And while that has a kind of set of issues associated with it, it all changes with Christianity when the barbarian becomes transformed into the pagan. Who is the pagan? The pagan is that human being destined for salvation, destined for baptism. And then it becomes a responsibility of Christendom to reach out to the pagan world and to baptize them, to bring them into the fold, to assimilate. So there's no longer a question of establishing a relationship. Friendly, loving, antagonistic, indifferent with the cultural other. Instead, it becomes an imperative of conquest, but really it's deeper than just conquest. There really is a tendency toward radical assimilation, which germinates there. The pagan then, in turn, as a category, gives way to the infidel with the emergence of Islam. The infidel then cannot fit into the category of the pagan because the infidel worships, the one God. Is monotheistic, prayerful, ostensibly the same God as the Christian God. So it becomes more difficult to understand how it is we relate to the so-called infidel. And then subsequent to the infidel, because eventually then you have a further transformation of political character with the, discovery of the New World and so on, where we have the notion of the wild man, these, societies, these primary or primitive, as they used to be called, societies that are initially romanticized as being without need. And that is a kind of terrifying prospect by now, because now what is going on is not simply the notion of extending Christendom, but extending the project of modernity itself, which is a project of conquering nature itself. And the wild man is nature, recalcitrant before the designs of science and technology to be dominated, which of course is unacceptable. The wild man has to be tamed. And the way this comes to pass conceptually is that gradually the wild man or the noble becomes noble savage, right? Because it's really Illich here is sort of drawing on a Rousseauian vision. The noble savage becomes transformed into the native, which is a kind of rehash of the pagan with, a modern twist. But eventually, as we come to the 20th century, the late 19th century, no, really into the 20th, the late 20th century, 1960s forward, the native becomes those people, those inhabitants of the world that are simply underdeveloped. So what you've done is you've dismissed the notion that human beings can be divided or separated or what have you in cultural terms, and replaced it with the idea that whatever point of difference arises can be addressed through the project of development, through the project of bringing everyone into excuse me, a space of industrial competence. Therein, lies the rub. Through all of this, what is dismissed is the idea that people have the ability to meet life on their own terms. To come back to the beginning of the video to wrap it up as we're approaching 20 minutes here, right? The breakdown of the viability of the left-right spectrum derives from the fact that Tacit, within relying merely on the left-right dichotomy, you have left tacit and unaddressed these issues of the industrial versus vernacular, as well as the soft versus hard technology. These presuppositions need to be brought to the surface to more effectively resolve the questions which face us at this time, questions which pertain to who and what we are, on a very fundamental level, who and what nature is in a very fundamental way, questions of life and death, not just, both literally and philosophically. And so I'm going to continue on here because what I've sketched here sort of really is just the main points teased out in the initial section of the essay. Next time we're going to come back and we're going to be looking more into language, the conquest of language, which is the second part of the essay, Vernacular Values by Ivan Illich. All right, thank you guys for listening, and I hopefully will speak with you all soon. Bye.